At 03:47 hours on the 18th of July, 1970, Firebase Ripcord in the Asau Valley of Thua Thien Province stops receiving incoming for 90 seconds, the calm between barrages. A soldier from Company D, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division stands upright in his sangar to move ammunition crates. He has slept in fragments across the previous day. The Pavan 324th B Division registration officer, positioned 4 kilometers northwest, releases a 6-round concentration. The soldier hears the first whistle and drops, but his legs fold a half-second late. The paradox: Ripcord holds more ammunition, aircraft sorties, and sandbags than any firebase in Asai Corps, yet men die in the open during supply tasks. The operational logic of 1970 states that firebase survival hinges on 3 variables: reinforced bunkers, continuous air resupply, and massed artillery counter-battery. May CV doctrine holds that a battalion on a hilltop with overhead cover, daily Huey lifts, and 8 tubes can withstand indefinite siege. Firebase Ripcord receives all 3 in abundance during its 23-day ordeal. Engineers emplaced timber and sandbag positions, rated for 122mm hits. The 101st Aviation Group flies resupply into the firebase under fire daily. Battery E, 2nd Battalion, 319th Artillery Regiment, fires counter-battery missions around the clock. Yet on the 23rd of July, 1970, the 101st Airborne Division abandons Ripcord under contact. The actual variable deciding survival at Ripcord is neurocognitive collapse under uninterrupted indirect fire. Pavan artillery and heavy mortars, particularly 122mm guns and 82mm mortars, fire at intervals approximating 40 to 90 minutes across the entire siege. Barrage spacing at this tempo prevents consolidated sleep. Whether this pattern reflects deliberate planning or emergent field practice remains unclear. Sleep fragmentation research from the 1960s demonstrates that humans denied REM cycles for 72 hours experience microsleep episodes, brief lapses lasting 2 to 10 seconds during which the brain enters sleep stage 1 regardless of environmental threat. At Ripcord, forward observers and radio operators log microsleeps during fire missions, missing splash warnings or calling wrong grid coordinates. The second failure mode is sensory habituation, the human startle reflex, mediated by the amygdala and autonomic nervous system, attenuates with repeated exposure to the same stimulus. By day 10 of the siege, men at Ripcord stop flinching at the whistle of incoming rounds. They remain standing during the danger window, the 90 seconds between spotting report and impact, because the sound has become ambient. The third collapse occurs in decision loops. Company and battalion command nets at Ripcord saturate with simultaneous transmissions, medevac requests, fire missions, resupply coordination, and spot reports. Under sleep deprivation, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for risk assessment and executive function, degrades. Commanders make risk-biased choices, sprinting across open ground during lulls instead of low crawling, stacking ammunition inside fighting positions to reduce exposure time, or freezing when movement is safer. Crew-served weapons teams mishandle procedures. Mortar crews at Ripcord experience 5-minute misfire holds while still under incoming fire, remaining exposed in gun pits because doctrine forbids abandoning a hung round. The geometry of small fighting positions creates secondary hazards, fragmentation from a near-miss ricochets inside sandbag walls, and the 50-meter danger radius for friendly artillery overlaps adjacent positions. This trifecta, sleep fragmentation leading to micro-sleeps, sensory dulling causing delayed reactions, and decision loop saturation producing judgment errors, drives the material failures. Ammunition handling mistakes occur not from lack of training but from operators in stage 1 sleep. Late displacement happens because habituated soldiers trust the calm between barrages. Misread fire missions result from degraded working memory on saturated radio nets. The firebase does not fall for lack of shells or sandbags. It falls because human cognition breaks first. The first proof of cognitive collapse appears in the sleep logs, informal but consistent, kept by medics at Ripcord during the siege. A Company D medic logged sleep fragments of less than 30 consecutive minutes by the 12th of July, 1970. Multiple platoon notes echo this pattern. The PA-VIN artillery pattern had the effect of preventing REM stage sleep. Barrages arrive at 0200, 0345, 0530, 0715 hours, and so on, ensuring that no sleep cycle reaches consolidation. Research conducted by the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in 1968 establishes that soldiers deprived of REM sleep for 96 hours exhibit reaction time delays of 30 to 50%. At Ripcord, forward observer teams miss shot and splash. Calls on fire missions because the radio operator enters microsleep during the critical 15-second window. On the 15th of July, 1970, a 105mm fire mission called by Company C, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry falls 200 meters short of the intended target, a PAVN mortar position on Hill 1000, because the FO transposes 2 digits in the grid coordinate during a microsleep episode. The short round lands inside the perimeter of a friendly position adjacent to Ripcord. Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas, commanding officer of 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, until his death on the 1st of July 1970, earlier described the radio traffic during peak contact hours in terms his executive officer later recalled, "You couldn't pass one call from another. Everyone was talking and no one was listening." The cognitive load of filtering overlapping transmissions while under fire exceeds the capacity of sleep-deprived operators. A study by RAND Corporation in 1969 on command and control degradation in high-tempo environments finds that radio net saturation above 70%, defined as multiple simultaneous transmissions blocking primary traffic, correlates with a 40% increase in friendly fire incidents and mission aborts. At Ripcord, battalion and company nets show heavy overlap for extended periods on the 18th of July, 1970. During this window, multiple fire missions are aborted because the Fire Direction Center cannot confirm target grids through the radio clutter. The sleep deficit also creates a cascade in judgment. Soldiers at Ripcord begin exhibiting risk-seeking behavior inconsistent with their training. On the 16th of July, 1970, a team from Company A, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry sprints 30 meters across open ground to retrieve an ammunition pallet dropped by Huey, ignoring the doctrine of low crawling during lulls. The PAVN forward observer on Hill 1000 spots the movement and calls a 6-round concentration. 2 soldiers are killed before reaching the pallet. Post-action interviews with survivors reveal that the men didn't think incoming would arrive because the previous barrage had ended only minutes earlier. The calm between barrages felt like safety. This is habituation in action. The absence of stimulus becomes indistinguishable from the end of threat. The prefrontal cortex, already degraded by sleep loss, cannot override the limbic system's false sense of security. A separate incident on the 19th of July, 1970, illustrates the freeze response. A squad from Company D, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, is caught in the open when PAVN guns fire a 10-round barrage. Instead of dispersing to nearby fighting positions, 4 men freeze in place for the entire 30-second impact window. One soldier later states he couldn't decide which direction to move. The decision paralysis is a documented symptom of acute sleep deprivation. The brain's executive function shuts down, leaving the individual unable to execute even simple motor plans. Not superior PAVN firepower, but the neurocognitive cost of living inside 90-second intervals. The second proof lies in the sensory habituation data captured through post-siege medical evaluations at Camp Eagle in Thua Thien province. On the 25th of July, 1970, 2 days after the Ripcord extraction, the 101st Airborne Division directs all personnel who served on the firebase to undergo screening for blast concussion and auditory trauma. Post-extraction screenings show elevated hearing thresholds in the frequency range of 2,000 to 4,000 Hz, the range of whistling artillery rounds, with unit-level percentages varying across reports. However, interviews with the same soldiers reveal that most stopped reacting to incoming rounds by day 12 of the siege. Specialist 4th Class Ron Dix, an M60 machine gunner with Company C, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, describes the habituation process in his post-action interview. First week, every whistle put you flat. Second week, you'd crouch. By the third, you'd just lean into the sandbags and keep working. The neuroscience of this phenomenon is well documented by 1970. The amygdala's threat detection circuit relies on novelty and unpredictability to trigger the startle reflex. When a stimulus repeats without variation, Pavan artillery, at Ripcord fires from the same azimuths and uses the same shell types throughout the siege, the amygdala downregulates its response. The body conserves energy by reducing cortisol and adrenaline output, and the startle reflex attenuates. This is adaptive in environments where the threat is non-lethal, but at Ripcord the threat remains constant and lethal. Men continue moving, standing, and working through the danger window because their brains classify incoming fire as background noise. The attenuation has lethal consequences. On the 17th of July, 1970, a resupply detail from Company B, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, is moving ammunition from the landing zone to forward positions when PAVN guns fire a 4-round concentration. Video footage recorded by a combat correspondent shows 2 soldiers remaining upright and continuing to carry crates for 3 full seconds after the first round impacts 50 meters away. Both are killed by the second round. The footage is later used by the 101st Airborne Division in after-action debriefs to illustrate the habituation problem. A separate medical study conducted in 1971 by the Neuropsychiatric Division at Walter Reed examines Ripcord survivors for post-traumatic stress disorder and finds an unusual pattern. 81% of interviewed personnel report auditory flashbacks, not of explosions, but of silence. The absence of incoming fire triggers hypervigilance because the brain has learned that silence precedes the next barrage. This inverted response, where safety cues produce anxiety, indicates that habituation at Ripcord rewired threat detection circuits at a fundamental level. The data also show a correlation between time spent on the firebase and habituation severity. Soldiers who arrived at Ripcord after the 10th of July, 1970, and remained through the extraction exhibit faster startle reflex decay than those present from the start of the siege. The implication is clear. The nervous system adapts to repeated exposure, but the adaptation is maladaptive in a lethal environment. The firebase's defensive posture, static, dug in, waiting for resupply, creates the conditions for habituation to take hold. Doctrine assumes that men will maintain vigilance indefinitely, but neurobiology shows that vigilance is a finite resource. At Ripcord, the resource depletes around day 10. After that, soldiers operate in a dulled state where incoming fire registers as sensation, but not threat. Not enemy accuracy, but the brain's refusal to stay alarmed. The third proof emerges from the decision loop collapse documented in battalion command logs and fire direction center records. On the 18th of July, 1970, Between 1400 and 2300 hours local time, the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry Command, net handles heavy radio traffic with multiple overlapping transmissions. Fire Direction Center turn time stretched to roughly double the 2-minute doctrinal goal. The delay is not caused by artillery readiness, it is caused by degraded communication under cognitive overload. Sleep-deprived radio operators struggle to process incoming information, prioritize calls, and execute procedures in the correct sequence. A study by the U.S. Army Combat Developments Command in 1969 establishes that decision accuracy drops by 35% when operators are awake for more than 36 hours. At Ripcord, most radio operators and forward observers exceed 72 hours of wakefulness by the 15th of July, 1970. The result is a cascade of small errors that compound into system failure. On the 19th of July, 1970, a forward observer with Company A, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, calls a fire mission against a suspected PAV and mortar position on Hill 1000. The observer provides a 6-digit grid coordinate, but the Fire Direction Center reads back a transposed number, swapping the 4th and 5th digits. The observer, operating on minimal sleep, acknowledges the incorrect readback without catching the error. The resulting mission places 12 rounds of 105 mm high-explosive 250 meters south of the intended target, into an area clear of enemy forces. The PAVN mortar team continues firing unmolested. A second incident on the 20th of July, 1970, illustrates the freeze or sprint dilemma created by impaired executive function. General Creighton Abrams, Commanding General of MACV, visits Camp Eagle to receive a briefing on Ripcord from the battalion leadership. Division recollections and after-action. Report notes indicate Abrams was told, "The men aren't sleeping, and they're making choices we can't explain." Abrams asks for an example, and the briefing officer describes an incident from the 19th of July, in which a squad leader ordered his men to run, not crawl, across 30 meters of open ground during a resupply lull, despite the presence of overhead cover 10 meters closer. 2 men were wounded by shrapnel when PAV and guns opened fire mid-sprint. The decision is attributed to fatigue, but the underlying mechanism is prefrontal cortex degradation. Under sleep deprivation, the brain shifts from deliberate, risk-averse decision-making to impulsive, high-variance choices. The squad leader chose speed over safety because his brain could no longer model delayed consequences. A parallel pattern appears in ammunition handling. Doctrine requires ammunition to be stored in dispersed, covered locations with sandbag blast walls between pallets. By the 16th of July, 1970, soldiers at Ripcord are stacking 105 mm rounds, mortar shells, and small arms crates inside fighting positions to minimize exposure time during resupply. The decision is rational on the surface. Less time in the open means less time under fire, but it concentrates blast risk. On the 21st of July, 1970, a PAVN 122 mm round scores a direct hit on a fighting position in the Company D sector. The resulting secondary explosion from stacked ammunition kills 3 soldiers and wounds 7 others. Post-blast analysis determines that the initial round would have caused 1 casualty. The ammunition stacking turned it into a mass casualty event. Not flawed tactics, but impaired operators executing those tactics under neurocognitive failure. The 4th proof is found in the air resupply failure patterns, which trace directly to pilot and crew cognitive degradation under repeated high-threat exposure. Between the 1st of July and the 23rd of July, 1970, helicopters from the 158th Aviation Battalion, 101st Aviation Group fly approximately 190 resupply and medevac attempts into Firebase Ripcord. Dozens of missions abort before landing due to ground fire, weather, or mechanical failure. However, after-action interviews with pilots reveal a fourth factor: decision paralysis in the cockpit during high-threat windows. A UH-1H pilot with the 158th Aviation Battalion describes a mission on the 17th of July, 1970, in which he aborted a resupply approach after hovering for approximately 8 seconds over the landing zone. "I froze. The LZ was taking fire, but I couldn't decide. Set down and take the hit, or wave off and leave the grunts without ammo. I hovered there until my crew chief screamed at me." The pilot's description matches the freeze response documented in sleep-deprived operators at Ripcord. By mid-July, pilots flying daily missions into the Firebase are averaging 4 hours of sleep per night due to early morning briefings and late-night maintenance schedules. The cognitive load of flying into a contested LZ, managing aircraft attitude, rotor clearance, ground fire threats, and verbal coordination with ground units exceeds the capacity of a sleep-deprived prefrontal cortex. The result is delayed decision-making or impulsive choices. On the 18th of July, 1970, a Huey from the 158th Aviation Battalion lands at Ripcord during a lull and remains on the ground for 45 seconds, 15 seconds longer than doctrine allows, because the pilot waits for ground personnel to finish loading wounded. PAVN forward observers spot the stationary aircraft and call a 4-round concentration. The Huey takes shrapnel damage to the tail boom and limps back to Camp Eagle with a wounded crew chief. The pilot's decision to wait reflects impaired risk assessment. The prefrontal cortex cannot weigh the marginal benefit of loading one more casualty against the exponential increase in threat exposure. A separate pattern appears in resupply load planning. Doctrine specifies that each Huey sortie into a contested LZ should carry maximum priority cargo, ammunition, water, and medical supplies to justify the risk. However, mission logs from the 158th Aviation Battalion show that on one mid-July sortie, a helicopter delivers mail and sundry packs instead of ammunition. The load decision was made by a logistics NCO at Camp Eagle, who had been awake for 31 hours coordinating back-to-back missions. The error is not malicious. It is the product of a fatigued operator working through a decision checklist without the cognitive bandwidth to assess priority. The mail arrives. The ammunition does not. Company C, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry reports critically low 105mm stocks by nightfall. The systemic nature of the collapse becomes visible in the shrinking resupply windows. On the 10th of July, 1970, the average time between Huey arrival and departure at Ripcord is 62 seconds. By the 20th of July, 1970, the average has dropped to 38 seconds. Pilots and ground crews are so conditioned to expect incoming fire that they execute unloading and loading procedures at sprints, bypassing safety checks. The speed reduces exposure but increases the rate of cargo handling errors, equipment damage, and incomplete offloads. A 158th Aviation Battalion mission log entry from the 21st of July, 1970, notes that 1 pallet of mortar ammunition is left on the LZ because the ground crew did not have time to move it before the Huey lifted off. The pallet is destroyed by PAVN fire within minutes. Not enemy marksmanship, but the compression of human decision-making into windows too narrow to sustain accuracy. By the 21st of July, 1970, the siege has lasted 21 days. Firebase Ripcord has not fallen, but it is no longer a defensive position. It is a neurocognitive attrition machine. The men inside do not surrender, but they stop trusting their own judgment. Radio operators double-check grids they once confirmed by reflex. Pilots hover over LZs, paralyzed. Soldiers stand in the open, waiting for the calm between barrages to break. The firebase holds, but the mines inside collapse first. On the 22nd of July, 1970, The commanding officer of 2nd Battalion 506th Infantry receives orders from the 101st Airborne Division commander to prepare for extraction. The decision to abandon Firebase Ripcord is not made because the perimeter is breached or the firebase is overrun. It is made because the cognitive and logistical cost of holding the position exceeds its tactical value. The extraction plan calls for a phased withdrawal under fire, with helicopters from the 158th Aviation Battalion lifting companies off the hilltop in sequence, while artillery from Camp Eagle and Phu Bai provides suppressive fire. The operation begins at 0600 hours on the 23rd of July, 1970. The final Huey lifts off at 1847 hours the same day, carrying the last 14 men of Company D, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry. PVN artillery continues firing into the abandoned firebase for 3 hours after the last American helicopter departs. In the after-action analysis conducted at Camp Eagle on the 25th of July, 1970, the 101st Airborne Division identifies material factors contributing to the decision to extract: diminishing helicopter availability due to maintenance backlogs, weather forecasts predicting reduced flight windows, and intelligence reports indicating PAVN reinforcement of artillery positions around the Asau Valley. However, the internal assessments, those not distributed outside division headquarters, cite a fourth factor: unit cohesion degradation due to sustained indirect fire exposure. The term cohesion degradation is a euphemism for what the medical detachment at Camp Eagle documents in post-extraction interviews. Men who can no longer execute basic tasks because their neurocognitive systems have failed. Soldiers report intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance during silence, and inability to sleep even when removed from the firebase. The auditory processing system has rewired itself to interpret quiet as the precursor to incoming fire. The calm between barrages has become a permanent internal state. Army medical teams in 1970 and 1971 document reaction time deficits, impaired risk assessment, and auditory flashbacks among sustained indirect fire cohorts. Ripcord is frequently cited as a high-exposure case. The implication is that Firebase Ripcord did not fail because PAVN forces were stronger, or because American material was insufficient. It failed because human cognition is a finite resource, and the PAVN 324th B Division understood how to exhaust it. Post-war PAVN interviews and histories describe the use of short fires with gaps to deny sleep. The degree to which this reflects formal doctrine versus field adaptation remains debated. Senior Colonel Nguyen Hu An, deputy commander of the 324th B Division during the Ripcord operation, describes the effect in a retrospective interview. "We did not need to destroy the firebase. We needed to make the Americans destroy themselves. Fire, wait, fire again. Keep them awake. Keep them guessing." The PAVN artillery tempo, barrages approximating 40 to 90 minutes apart, had the effect of preventing sleep consolidation without exhausting ammunition stocks. The strategy appears in earlier firebase sieges in 1969. By the time Ripcord was established in April 1970, the PAVN had refined the technique into a system. The American response, fortification, air resupply, and counter-battery fire, addressed the material threat but ignored the cognitive dimension. Misfire doctrine in 1970 assumes that soldiers can maintain combat effectiveness indefinitely as long as they receive food, water, ammunition, and medical care. The doctrine does not account for sleep deprivation, sensory habituation, or decision loop saturation. The result is a firebase that holds its ground but loses its ability to function as a coherent military unit. The extraction on the 23rd of July, 1970, is operationally successful. No soldiers are left behind, and PAVN forces do not advance beyond the abandoned perimeter. But the strategic outcome is a PAVN victory. The 101st Airborne Division withdraws from the Esau Valley and does not return. The Firebase network in western Thua Thien province contracts, ceding terrain to Pavan forces. The lesson learned from Ripcord, that static firebases in artillery range of Pavan guns are unsustainable, propagates through MACV planning for the next 18 months. But the deeper lesson, that human cognition is the limiting factor in sustained high-threat environments, is not formalized in doctrine. It appears in medical studies, after-action reports, and classified assessments, but it does not reshape operational planning. The U.S. military continues to design defensive positions around material variables, bunker strength, ammunition stockpiles, air support, and treats human endurance as a constant. Firebase Ripcord demonstrates that endurance is not constant. It is a curve that degrades under specific conditions, and those conditions are replicable. The Pavan 324th B Division replicated them. The outcome was not a collapse of firepower or fortification, but a collapse of the human systems operating inside those fortifications. The men at Ripcord did not lack courage or competence. They lacked sleep, and in the absence of sleep, their brains made errors that training could not prevent. The firebase held for 23 days, but the siege inside, the one fought in micro-sleep episodes, habituated reflexes, and saturated decision loops, never stopped, not even after the helicopters lifted off. In the years following the extraction, Firebase Ripcord enters the historical record as a tactical withdrawal executed under pressure, a footnote in the larger narrative of Vietnamization and American disengagement from Corps. The Firebase is not memorialized with the same intensity as Khe Sanh or Hamburger Hill. There is no congressional inquiry, no widely circulated book, no film adaptation. The soldiers who served at Ripcord return home and scatter. Some remain in the army, most do not. The after-action reports are filed, the casualty statistics are compiled, and the operational lessons are distilled into classified briefs that circulate within the Pentagon but do not reach public discourse. The neurocognitive dimension, the sleep deprivation, the habituation, the decision loop collapse, is documented in medical studies conducted at Walter Reed and the Neuropsychiatric Division, but these studies remain restricted for decades. When the files are declassified in the 1990s, the findings are absorbed into the academic literature on combat stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, but they do not reshape military doctrine. Few near-term formal countermeasures appear in doctrine. Lessons mostly circulate in medical literature and after-action report annexes. Firebase Ripcord fades from collective memory, but it persists in the individual memories of the men who lived through it. The auditory flashbacks, the hypervigilance during silence, the involuntary flinch at sudden noises. These are the permanent markers of a siege that never fully ended. The Pavan 24th B Division moves on to other targets in the Esau Valley, refining its artillery techniques and applying them to subsequent firebase engagements. The lessons of Ripcord are encoded into PAVN operational planning, and later shared with Allied forces in Cambodia and Laos. The strategy of neurocognitive attrition, using indirect fire to exhaust human endurance rather than destroy physical infrastructure, becomes a standard PAVN tactic for the remainder of the war. The Americans, by contrast, do not adopt countermeasures. There are no doctrinal updates requiring sleep rotation protocols, no changes to firebase design to mitigate habituation, no communications upgrades to reduce net saturation. Firebase Ripcord teaches a lesson, but the lesson is not learned. The siege at Firebase Ripcord ends on the 23rd of July, 1970, when the last helicopter lifts 14 men off a hilltop in the Esau Valley. The Pavan artillery falls silent. The barrage stops, but for the men who flew out that day, the calm between barrages never arrives. The interval, the 90 seconds of waiting, listening, anticipating, becomes a permanent condition, fire stopped. The siege inside never did.